At 12 minutes past 8 in the morning on the 7th of April, 1945, a single Grumman F-6F Hellcat from the carrier Essex broke through the low cloud cover hanging over the East China Sea and banked hard to hold its position. The pilot looked down, 30,000 feet below him. Moving at 25 knots through a gray chop was the largest warship ever built. He had been briefed on what he might find, but the briefing had not quite prepared him for the reality. Even from altitude, through broken overcast and the gray-green water of an April squall line, the Yamato looked wrong. Too large, too massive, disproportionate in the way that certain objects are when you encounter them in the real world and the scale refuses to register. At 63,000 tons full load, she was longer than 3 football fields. Her main belt armor was 410 millimeters of cemented steel, angled to shed incoming rounds. Her turret faces were 650 millimeters thick. The 9 guns of her main battery, arranged in 3 triple turrets, were 18.1 inches in bore diameter, the largest naval guns ever mounted on any warship in history. Each of those guns was 21 meters long and weighed nearly 150 tons, and each could hurl a 1,460-kilogram armor-piercing shell across 42 kilometers of open water. The 3 turrets combined weighed more than a dozen destroyers. The pilot keyed his radio and reported the contact. Then he settled in to shadow the fleet below and waited for what was coming. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. What was coming had been in motion for hours. Aboard the fleet carrier Bunker Hill, flying the flag of Task Force 58, Vice Admiral Mark Andrew Mitscher had been awake since before dawn. Mitscher was 57 years old, and the Pacific War had used most of those years. He was gaunt in the way of men who have been ill and stayed at sea anyway, hollow-cheeked, perpetually squinting, with a face that naval correspondents consistently described as resembling some kind of raptor. His call sign was Bald Eagle. He wore a long-billed cotton cap turned backwards, a habit he had developed years earlier to keep the wind off his face during flight deck operations, and he smoked through long silences on the bridge. He had first gone to sea in 1910. He had been a naval aviator since 1916, back when the entire aircraft carrier concept was still theoretical. By April of 1945, he commanded the most powerful naval air force ever assembled in the history of warfare. The question before him that morning was not whether he could stop the Yamato. That was not really a question at all. The question was whether someone else would be allowed to do it instead. To understand why that distinction mattered, and it mattered enormously, not just for the outcome of April 7th, but for everything that followed, you have to understand what the Yamato represented to the Japanese Naval General Staff, and what it represented to the 2 competing schools of thought inside the American Fleet Command. The Yamato had been designed in the middle 1930s under the doctrine of Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle strategy. Japan's naval planners understood from the outset that they could not match the United States in industrial output or raw numbers. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had formally enshrined Japan's inferiority, setting a battleship tonnage ratio of 5 to 5 to 3 between the United States, Britain, and Japan. The Japanese answer, developed through the 1930s by engineers working in extreme secrecy at Kure Naval Arsenal, was to build one ship so far beyond anything the Americans possessed that a single engagement between fleets would not be decided by numbers. Design work began in 1934. The keel was laid on the 4th of November, 1937. Yamato was launched on the 8th of August, 1940, and formally commissioned on the 16th of December, 1941, 9 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The secrecy surrounding her construction was extraordinary by any standard. Her dimensions were concealed from Japanese civilian workers through elaborate partitioning of the shipyard. American naval intelligence did not know her actual displacement or gun caliber until after the war. As late as July of 1945, for months after Yamato had been sunk, Jane's fighting ships was still listing her main armament as 9 16-inch guns. The truth was worse than anything the Americans had estimated. At full load, she displaced more than 71,000 tons. Her guns outranged the American 16-inch 50-caliber weapons on the Iowa class. Nothing in the Allied fleet could match her in a conventional gunnery engagement. She had, however, spent most of the war avoiding conventional gunnery engagements. The logic of Kantai-Kessen assumed a decisive surface battle that never came in the form the Japanese Navy anticipated. Midway, in June of 1942, had been decided entirely by carrier aircraft before a single capital ship fired on another. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, in June of 1944, had consumed the heart of Japan's carrier aviation in 2 days of aerial combat the Americans would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, in October 1944, had been the largest naval battle in history by almost any measure, and it had ended with the effective destruction of Japanese naval power as an organized force. Through all of it, Yamato had fired her great guns in anger only once, against American escort carriers off Samar, where she had helped sink the Gambier Bay before turning away. Her fuel consumption in action was ruinous. A full-speed sortie burned through thousands of tons of fuel oil, and by 1944 Japan's petroleum supply chain was collapsing under American submarine pressure. By the spring of 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy barely existed. What remained were scattered remnants. A handful of destroyers, a few cruisers, a light carrier with no trained pilots, and Yamato sitting at Tokuyama anchorage in Japan's inland sea, consuming fuel simply by existing. The Naval General Staff faced a question with no comfortable answer. The Emperor Hirohito, briefed in late March on the Army's plans for the defense of Okinawa, where American forces had landed on the 1st of April, had asked, in the account preserved by his chamberlains, where the Navy was. What was the Navy doing to contribute? Admiral Somu Toyota, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, ordered the development of Operation Tengo. The plan was, by the standards of 1945, a formalized acknowledgement of defeat. Yamato, the cruiser Yahagi, and 8 destroyers would sortie from Tokuyama on the 6th of April. They would proceed south through the Bungo Strait, transit the East China Sea, and fight their way to Okinawa. There, after inflicting whatever damage they could on the American invasion fleet, Yamato would be deliberately run aground on the coast between Higashi and Yomitan. Her surviving crew would disembark to reinforce the Japanese garrison. Her 9 main guns, her 24 5-inch dual-purpose mounts, her 162 25mm anti-aircraft weapons, would continue firing from a fixed position until American fire destroyed her. The phrase used in the operational order was Special Attack, Tokubetsu Kogiki. In the vocabulary of 1945, that phrase had only one meaning. The ships were to receive only enough fuel oil for a one-way passage. Local base commanders at Tokuyama, on their own authority and in apparent defiance of the spirit of the order, loaded each ship to approximately 60% of fuel capacity. It would not change the outcome. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, who would command the operation at sea from Yamato's bridge, initially refused the assignment outright. Ito was 54 years old, a professional naval officer of the old school who had spent 30 years studying the doctrine of decisive battle. He knew precisely what a formation of 10 warships without air cover would face when it met the American Fifth Fleet. He told the staff officers who briefed him that the mission was futile and wasteful, and he would not execute it. The staff briefed him again, this time conveying that the Emperor personally expected the Navy to mount a visible effort in defense of Okinawa. Ito accepted command. Captain Tamichi Hara, commanding the Yahagi, later recorded his own assessment of the plan in a phrase that was both precise and final. It was, he wrote, like throwing an egg against a rock. The captains of all 10 ships were called to Yamato for a briefing on the 5th of April. According to multiple accounts, they were unanimous in rejecting the plan as a waste of lives and resources. They were told about the Emperor's expectations. Every one of them executed his orders. Crews were informed of the mission and given the opportunity to remain behind. None did. On the evening of the 5th of April, an officer on Yahagi organized a party for the crew. Many of the men drank heavily and sang through the night. At 4 in the afternoon on the 6th of April, the Surface Special Attack Force cleared Tokuyama. American submarines were waiting. The USS Threadfin and USS Hackleback had been positioned in the Bungo Strait, the only practical exit route from the inland sea between Kyushu and Shikoku, as part of a broader surveillance network that had been tracking Japanese preparations for days. American signals intelligence, through ultra-intercepts processed by the Joint Intelligence Center Pacific Ocean area, had obtained detailed, advanced knowledge of Operation Tengo. An intercept dated the 5th of April had identified the sailing order, the composition of the force, and the intended route. The commanders of the two submarines sighted Yamato's formation shortly after it cleared the strait. The formation was moving at high speed and zigzagging against torpedo attack, and neither submarine was able to get into an attack position. But the contact reports flashed immediately to the 5th Fleet Command and to Task Force 58. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the 5th Fleet from his flagship Indianapolis, received the first definitive sighting reports before 9 in the morning on the 7th. His initial response was entirely consistent with his background. Spruance was not an aviator. He had built his career in surface warfare, and he commanded, as part of his fleet, a powerful battle group under Rear Admiral Mortandeo. 6 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 21 destroyers, including the Massachusetts, New Jersey, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Indiana, and Missouri, the most powerful surface action force ever assembled under the American flag. He signaled Deo to prepare his battleships to intercept the Japanese formation. Deo's superior, Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, advised him in a signal widely remembered among the fleet, "Hope you will bring back a nice fish for breakfast." Deo began composing his reply. "Many thanks, we'll try to." Even as he wrote it, the radio brought fresh news. Mitscher had already moved. The competitive dynamic between Mitscher and Spruance was not new. The two men had served together since 1944, and the tension between carrier aviators and surface officers ran through the entire command structure of the Pacific Fleet. Mitscher regarded Spruance as a gun club admiral, methodical, capable, but constitutionally unable to fully grasp what carrier aviation could do when unleashed. Spruance regarded Mitscher with respect that was nonetheless hedged by a belief that aviators tended toward what he called the aggressive solution regardless of whether the situation demanded it. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, this same friction had produced the well-known controversy over Spruance's decision not to send Mitscher's carriers surging westward after the Japanese fleet, a decision that allowed the Japanese surface ships to escape even as their air strength was being annihilated. Mitscher's staff had reportedly wanted him to seek Spruance's relief over it. On the morning of April 7, 1945, Mitscher received his formal orders. They directed Task Force 58 to concentrate its offensive effort on combat air patrols to meet enemy air attacks. They did not specifically authorize a strike against the Yamato formation. They also did not specifically forbid one. Mitscher and his staff went through the order the way experienced staffers always read an order they wish to execute around, looking for what it did not say. The order had said nothing about his carriers not being able to go hunting. At 10 in the morning, before Deo's battleships had closed to engagement range, before Spruance had formally confirmed or denied permission, Mitscher launches aircraft. He notified Spruance that the strikes were airborne as they were departing the flight decks. Spruance, given the accomplished fact, gave retroactive approval but ordered Deo's battleships to continue north in case the aircraft did not finish the job. They would not be needed. The strike launched from 11 carriers. Task Group 58.1 from San Jacinto, Bennington, Hornet, and Belleauwood. Task Group 58.3 from Essex, Bunker Hill, Bataan, and Cabot. And Task Group 58.4 from Intrepid, Yorktown, and Langley. A fourth task group, 58.2, had been detached to provide air defense for the carriers Franklin and Enterprise, damaged in earlier kamikaze strikes and undergoing repairs. The aircraft airborne from the 11 participating carriers numbered 386. They were Grumman F-6F Hellcats configured as fighter bombers, Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, and Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo planes, and they flew north through 8 tense cloud cover at 3,000 feet, in poor visibility, toward a radar contact that the Essex search units had positively identified at 8:22 in the morning as one battleship, 2 cruisers, and 8 destroyers, bearing approximately 315 degrees, at a distance of roughly 300 miles from the main fleet anchorage off Okinawa. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Aboard Yamato's bridge, the radar operator ensign Mitscher Yoshida, who would survive the battle and later publish the only first-person account written by an officer who had been on the bridge itself, was tracking the American contacts on his screen. He watched them resolve from large blobs into formations, then into individual aircraft. From the bridge came orders in quick succession. The formation increased to 25 knots. Anti-aircraft batteries were manned and loaded. Yamato's captain, Rear Admiral Kosuke, whose last command this was, had been preparing his crew for this moment since they left Tokuyama. Vice Admiral Ito, on the 6th deck of the bridge tower, watched through binoculars as the first aircraft appeared through the broken overcast. He had known from the beginning that it would end here. He had said so, clearly and on the record. He had been overruled by institutional obligation and the Emperor's expectation. Now he braced himself against the binocular stand and prepared to observe the fulfillment of his own prediction. The attack began at 12:32 in the afternoon. The coordination the Americans had planned for did not survive contact with the target. 3 task groups had launched their aircraft in sequence, with the intention of arriving in coordinated waves. But the poor weather and the eagerness of individual strike leaders had dissolved the plan before it reached execution. Each carrier group was pressing to be first over the target. Ensign Harry Jones, flying an Avenger from Torpedo Squadron 17 off the Hornet, later recalled that the flight leader from another carrier had handed over navigation lead to his group after developing engine trouble, and the composite formation had pressed ahead through the rain and scud. When a Yamato formation appeared below them, the strike leader's order of attack was read off by carrier over the radio. Hornet aircraft would go first, followed by the others in sequence. But the sequence collapsed almost immediately as pilots from multiple carriers drove toward the same target simultaneously. The fear of mid-air collision was real and noted in multiple after-action reports. Over the target at any given moment during the battle, there were American aircraft at nearly every altitude from wave-top height to 15,000 feet, dive bombers pushing over into their attack runs, torpedo planes threading between the water and the enemy's secondary battery fire, Hellcats making strafing runs to suppress the anti-aircraft gunners and draw attention from the Avengers making their low, slow, straight-line approaches. Yamato's anti-aircraft battery opened fire immediately. She had been refitted repeatedly through the war specifically to handle air attack. By April of 1945, she carried 12 dual 5-inch mounts, 54 triple 25mm mounts totaling 162 barrels, and additional lighter weapons. Her main battery had been loaded with a special anti-aircraft round, the Sanshiki type, sometimes called a beehive shell, which exploded into nearly 3,000 incendiary fragments set to a time fuse, converting the 18-inch guns into a form of monstrous shotgun designed to scatter destruction through incoming formations. The main battery fired these rounds at the attacking aircraft. It made an enormous noise and threw up spectacular geysers of smoke and fire. It killed no American aircraft. The first torpedo hit Yamato on the port side within minutes of the attack's opening. Then a second. Bombs came down through the overcast simultaneously, and 2 struck the starboard side near the aft director tower, destroying the aft radar room and starting fires that could not be fully controlled. The Japanese damage control parties, experienced men who had drilled for this scenario across 3 years of war, moved to contain the flooding. They counter-flooded the corresponding starboard compartments to check the list developing on the port side. For the first half hour of the battle, the damage control effort was partially effective. Yamato continued to make speed. Her guns continued firing. The formation around her fought back. The Yahagi took a torpedo in her engine room in the first minutes of the attack and came to a dead stop, and she would be hit by 6 more torpedoes and 12 bombs before she sank at 2 in the afternoon. But several of the destroyers maintained their stations, and their own anti-aircraft fire was adding to the curtain of steel the Japanese were throwing up against the American aircraft. None of it was enough. The American pilots had identified immediately that Yamato's armor belt was so thick that torpedoes running at the standard depth of 10 feet were detonating against hardened steel without penetrating to vital spaces. Within the first wave, torpedo squadron leaders adjusted their running depths to 20 feet, where the attack would strike below the main belt against the comparatively lighter hull plating of the lower sections. The adjustment was made in the air, by pilots observing the results of their predecessors' runs and revising their own attacks accordingly. The tactical modification was not directed by any flag officer or strike coordinator. It was made on the spot by men in aircraft over the target, under fire, watching what was working and what was not. By 1 in the afternoon, Yamato had absorbed at least 7 torpedo hits concentrated on her port side and could no longer correct her list through counterflooding alone. Captain Ariga ordered the deliberate flooding of the starboard outer engine room, a calculated sacrifice of 300 men at their stations, to physically restore the ship's trim. The flooding partially worked. The list eased. Yamato continued south. At approximately 2 in the afternoon, the third American wave arrived. Task Group 58.4's 106 aircraft, which had launched 45 minutes behind the others and had taken longer to find the target through the cloud cover, came over the horizon to find the Yamato already listing appreciably and the water around her heavy with debris and oil and the wreckage of her escorts. The strike group from Intrepid, Yorktown, and Langley pressed their attacks. 6 more torpedoes struck the port side in rapid succession. 5 of them hit to the high side, the side the ship was already rolling toward, aggravating a list that counterflooding could no longer correct. The uncorrected list reached 15 degrees, then 20. The forward main battery magazine temperature alarms began to fire as flooding advanced toward the powder handling rooms, and there were no longer working pumps to flood them preventively. At 2 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, Ito descended the ladder from his position on the bridge tower to his sea cabin 1 level below. He had already given his last operational order. Stop the mission. Rescue the survivors. The other ships were to save themselves. He had shaken hands with his staff officers one by one. No one who saw him descend that ladder survived to say what he said when he went below. He did not come back up. He wrote that Yamato had gone to her death like the nation she represented, committed, organized, and without any realistic hope of the outcome the commitment was supposed to produce. The Yamato Museum in Kure, the city where she was built, opened in 2005. It contains a full-scale replica of the forward section of the ship, built to the same exterior dimensions as the original, occupying the center of a purpose-built building. The museum sits on the shore of Hiroshima Bay, within sight of the shipyard where the actual hull was laid down in the winter of 1937. Visitors can walk up to the bow section and see the scale at which the ship was built, the height of the main gun turrets, the breadth of the hull. The museum's permanent collection includes accounts of the crew and artifacts from the wreck. It does not minimize what the ship represented or how it was used. Yamato has remained prominent in Japanese popular culture in ways that are complicated and not fully resolved. She is simultaneously a symbol of technological achievement, a monument to wasted lives, and an emblem of an institutional failure that sent men to their deaths on a mission their own commanders had already assessed as futile. Mark Mitscher died on the 3rd of February, 1947, 18 months after the war's end. The accumulated strain of years at sea had damaged his health beyond recovery. He was 59 years old. A destroyer was named after him. His actions on the 7th of April were noted in his official evaluation as demonstrating the decisive employment of carrier air power in offensive operations. The phrase captures the event correctly, but says nothing about what Mitscher himself knew when he launched those aircraft without waiting for Spruance's authorization. That the question he was actually answering was not about the Yamato. It was about which instrument of naval war would define the century that followed. The battleship Missouri, which had been among the vessels in Deo's formation that turned around and returned to Okinawa that day without firing her 16-inch guns at a Japanese warship, would 4 months later host the formal surrender ceremony, ending the war in the Pacific. It was the last act performed by a battleship that could not have been performed as well or better by a carrier. No nation has laid down a battleship since. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.